Merci Francis Rambert.
Thank you, Francis Rambert. Thank you, Luciana Valmorel, for coordinating today's conference. Thank you all for being here. We're very lucky to have the crème of la crème of French urban design here with us, and we'll introduce them. I think a lot of you know them already, and they know each other very well. They work together, they have worked together, sometimes in the same team, sometimes in competing teams. But I think all four of them have this great ability to renew urban design
qu'il représente et qu'il théorise à différents niveaux qu'on va essayer de déplier en espérant que la dimension publique de l'événement permette de porter la discussion vers un débat.
Talk about the way they see urban design. I'm delighted to moderate this conversation, but I would like to share my despair today that only men are here and that we don't have a 50% female representation. I know everybody's trying, everybody's making their best efforts.
J'espère que les organisateurs ne seront pas rigueur de commencer un petit aparté que vous pourrez tout à fait qualifier de rabat-joie en citant la chercheuse Sarah Ahmed.
Furious at me by quoting Sarah Ahmed, and I am an activist for gender equality, and there were supposed to be 2 other women, and I would like to recall that the presence of expert women is important in all layers of society, especially in a public symposium, and I think you will all share that idea with me. It's not just a principle, but it's also about renewing representations, points of views, and also to talk to the young people, especially when some of us and some of you here on stage and in the room teach in schools in France and abroad. We're talking about public space, the ability to go from one place to another, and as Francis Rambert said this morning, talking about public space as a space of democracy, it's also a space for equality. This discussion could have been fed by women experts. We could have invited Catherine Poulin, Catherine Galès, Julie Hidalgo, and Claire Val, Jacqueline Ostier, and many other women. If this situation ever occurs to you, you can always ask a colleague, a female expert, to talk on your behalf and instead of you, and that's not a joke. So we're going to talk about landscapes of mobilities, and not just about one landscape, just not talking about the landscape, but multiple landscapes that mobilities allow for.
De leur représentation, de leur transformation et de leurs usages. Alors on a une petite heure pour échanger.
So we will have 1 hour to talk, and maybe some time for questions for the room, and I would like to thank the interpreters, and the interpreters thank you as well. Djamel Klouche, architect, urban designer, you teach at the Architecture Institute of Versailles. You created an urban design studio in Paris, AUC, that in 2008 was selected among the 10 teams to advise the Grand Paris project, and you were also part of the LéaV project in the north of Paris. Bas Smets, you're based in Brussels, you're an architect and a landscaper. You've worked on many different projects regarding public space and also integrating A71 motorway into the nature.
Il est le mandataire de l'équipe lauréate du concours de reconception des espaces publics de Notre-Dame ici à Paris.
Also part of the rebuilding of Notre-Dame University, and you also teach at the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University. Alexandre Labasse is an architect after chairing several institutes in Paris. You are the head of Apur in Paris that documents, analyzes urban and social evolutions in Paris and in the area. And finally, Pierre-Alain Trévélo, architect, urban designer, co-founder with Antoine Léger-Collet of TVK Studio. You participated since the very beginning of the Grand Paris project in 2008. And more recently, among many other projects, TVK has carried out a study to design future metro stations. You teach at Paris University. That's it for the presentations. Marc Barani said this morning in a roundtable that modernity has led to architectures that can be modified, that support projects. So maybe we'll start with Pierre-Alain Trévélo at TVK. You started dealing with landscapes through infrastructure. So my first question would be, what has changed since the beginning of the modern era in the way you infrastructure? Hello everyone, Océane. I could have asked a woman to speak here instead of me, indeed, but since I'm here, I'm going to present some images to start this conversation. And yes, starting from talking about infrastructure, infrastructure is often talked in a technical way, thinking that it's a necessary evil. But as Marani said this morning, infrastructures are structures that have modified territories and areas of living space. And they have become very powerful. And we need to understand the infrastructure. Usually we talk about infrastructure with a lot of tensions. And there are two ideas. First, the idea that infrastructure, and particularly for mobility, with the necessity of continuity and continuity in a very soft slope, these have modified the way we move around the city. There is no territorial continuity. And these structures or infrastructures are seen like mountains or rivers, so obstacles with which we need to deal with. So there's an opposition between continuity and divide that we need to continue working on. Now, another concept, which is the idea that infrastructure in France, in Europe, are public spaces, but they are hyper-specialized in terms of use and function. But as in any public space, they can be considered historically, thinking that they have always evolved, and we shouldn't think in terms of temporary infrastructure. So if we zoom in at Paris infrastructure, here including the Seine River, which has always been a part of Paris, which has defined Paris, to a great extent. So very briefly, with a few images, you can understand more of the concepts that I just talked about with projects that we worked at in our studio. Starting with the concept of public space and the idea that hypermobility should lead to a public space dedicated to people who don't need to, who don't want to move, where people are here, waiting, wandering. So it's about people staying here, about the ability to be somewhere in a space, in a specific area, without being forced to move. And I think these public spaces should integrate more the concept of horizontal ground. It's a subject in Lausanne. You know, this city has many slopes, and we wanted the square in front of the train station to be a flat place, because then programs, developments are different when the ground is very horizontal, very flat. So it's about, it's not just about moving, it's about other uses that are not linked to mobility. A second example here in Rome, again, the square outside the train station, and there's also here an idea of horizontality, flat space, and also about integrating nature in these public spaces, because these public spaces are connected to the nature, to the ground, to the soil, and to the sky. It's about creating specific climates here, and we've often talked here and with the SGP to highlight both the social but also the environmental role of public space. When you build buildings or infrastructure, there can be very high costs, but for public space, it's not the same cost at all. And finally, with a few images, two different projects in Paris.
Avec laquelle j'ai commencé, du Redville épais, du Redville en 3 dimensions et de la nécessité de faire avec cette
disponibilité.
L'idée intéressante selon moi, c'est que ça produit des moments de ville singuliers, des quartiers
particuliers. A ground that's segmented for specific uses, finding specific programs regarding housing, for instance. So it's looking at these areas in a different way. Here in Paris, we see 2 different floors, and around these you have railway. And in La Porte-Couchée, it's not well known because it's inside the circular road, circular ring. But you can walk there, and this can be used as a different public space as well. And so there's the idea of building a square here, and that people can walk across in very different ways, either by stopping there, being in a garden, or walking along the avenue. And it's also about highlighting the infrastructure. Mobility infrastructure is architecture. They are shelters. You have roofs and ceilings. They can have a role. They create temporary or permanent uses. So they become very peculiar places. with peculiar types and functions and roles. It means that architects, developers, and operators have to find specific areas. For instance, in the right-hand side, this is a firefighter brigade here that can be used for other things. So it's about having mobility infrastructures that create a peculiar place and peculiar conditions.
Alors, on avait prévu de parler de la grande échelle.
Right, so we also wanted to scale things up, but perhaps we can actually tweak our program and hear you, Bas Smets, for your presentation. Bas Smets, you define yourself as a landscaping architect, and your projects, I believe, are more based on landscape engineering, as we saw with your projects in La Défense recently.
Magnifique. Merci.
That's great. Thank you. So I decided to talk to you about La Défense, to address the notion of mobility as a press harder, I guess. So La Défense, Central Business District in Paris.
Et moi, j'aime bien aborder cette réalité comme si c'était une nouvelle nature, comme si la force humaine,
human strength, as Vernat said, can produce new places, new jungles. So it's great to shed a new light on things and to come up with new types of landscapes. Here, for example, this is the CNIT Center and the Division Leclerc Avenue, which completely disappears 14 meters later under the La Défense parvis, and 1,000 micropillars were resorted to by the Fauchon, by architect Fauchon, to support the 4,000 square meters of area over there. And the request was to create urban connections between the La Défense Esplanade and the Courbevoie streets just a few meters away from there. And when I was called upon for this project, I really pondered about the general environment over there, and I thought, look, in order to really understand reality as an actual place, that really reminds me of mountains and rocks. You know, it's all rocks. Everything is reflected from one mountain to the next. It's all rocks and greenery. I really enjoy hiking in the mountains, and when you're hiking, you know, it all depends whether you're under a tree or not. If you're under a tree, then you have some shadow, but then once you're no longer hiking under trees, then you no longer have that shelter. And I thought, right, perhaps we can transpose this and have kind of a tree line in La Défense. Perhaps with these urban connections, new urban connections, we can plant as many trees as possible. And the developer told me that the agreement was to plant at least 9 trees. That was my only request. So I had these 9 trees that I had to plant. And I looked at the map and I was like, okay, so we have that strange shape. We have these beams, no way we can plant them. We can not plant anything on accessibility roads either, or on those lanes dedicated to fire fighters. So after 2 years of harsh negotiations, we were able to identify 53 spots where we may plant trees. He wanted more. I wanted just these 53, and I thought, okay, 40 cubic square meters per tree, that's quite good, a ratio. So we prepared the trees 3 years ahead in nurseries. And then they were up and ready for D-Day. So on scale, 53 centimeters of continuous soil. And I sketched out the structure myself. Here you have these metallic cages to support trees, and as you can see, you know, it's an ongoing soil cover of 4,000 square meters or 2,000 cubic meters. And here we have the fertile ground that's underneath these slabs. Now they have grown since. They're 15 meters high. They produce shadow. Lots of birds chirping in these trees as well. And here they are between La Défense and Courbevoie.
Alors, vous nous parliez de
All right, so you spoke to us about climate.
Je rappelle quand même que pour obtenir un
But
nouveau
you know,
sol fertile, il faut quand même
have an actually fertile ground, you need 1,000 years to pass. So that's, I guess, another take on fertile ground. And perhaps we can zoom out when it comes to climate. The Apur authority has produced a number of maps that you can still check out here for another few days. And so when you zoom out and look at the territory in its entirety, Alexandre, Labasse, what can you take away from these views? Yes, we participated in the exhibition, and I'd like to thank this opportunity, to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting us. You know, we tried to assess the situation, analyze things, put things into perspective, and anticipate what may happen. In order to do so, we can resort to maps. And a couple of days ago, as we were preparing for today's session, we thought, okay, we need to speak about landscapes and the metropolis, and the first thing that came to my mind was, well, actually, mobility in terms of surface. How can you present that Paris scale?
Donc sur la métropole, il y a à peu près 80 000 hectares.
80,000 hectares of surface area for the metropolis, of which 15,000
hectares d'espace public. Et les 15 000 hectares d'espace public, il faut rajouter à peu près 5 000 hectares d'espace public, enfin d'espace ferroviaire parcellisé, donc on arrive à 20 000. Donc en gros, la mobilité, c'est 25% de notre territoire.
Accounts for pretty much 25% of our territory, and as Nicolas Simpson was saying, that's what connects you and separates you from others. As we were mapping out,
comme emprise de mobilité, en tout cas comme emprise de surface, essayer de regarder comment on l'utilise. Alors là, il y a et ça a été dit. Évidemment, par la maire de Cachan précédemment, il y a aussi une mutation des façons de se déplacer dans la métropole très importante. Quand on reprend le GT aujourd'hui, donc l'enquête générale des transports, on voit qu'il y a moins 40% de voitures dans le Paris intramuros. Il y a aussi moins 21% de
less of car transportation in Paris central area.
Là, ce qu'on a montré, c'est plutôt la dynamique très puissante du vélo
qu'on voit aujourd'hui,
also that now cycling has
40%
de déplacements à vélo
really developed, plus 35% in terms of metropolis to metropolis commute by cycling. So that's huge. 2,100 kilometers of cycling lanes are also currently being developed. Number 3, and that was a must with Jean-François Montagne and Dominique Perrault. So we have that map of transportation that's underground, so we started mapping out with the RATP data starting from the center of Paris. So the underground landscape, what does it look like? The idea was to fully map the metropolis 3D. Line number 1, -2 meters, line under the surface, and line 14 is at -25 meters under the surface. So the lighter here, the more shallow. 4 million travelers per day on average. And for the greater Paris area, 3 million passengers per day. So the scale is completely different, the landscape is completely different. So tomorrow's mobility landscape, what will it look like? Well, it will be larger in terms of surface area, and with the Cité des Grands Projets, we worked on accessibility to cultural sites in the greater Paris area. The idea was to assess how you may access these sites by foot, 5 or 10 minutes away by foot, and when you also take into account the Grand Paris Express map, you realize that there are more than 700 stations.
C'est particulièrement intéressant. Et puis le dernier paysage que je voulais vous montrer,
which will be included in that map, and the pollution also should be taken into consideration when it comes to mobility. That's a landscape that may lead to certain impacts. So here you have the NO2 map. On ground, you're at 40. In just a few years, we dropped the NO2 level significantly. But we went from -40% along the network. So on the one hand, that's due to lower speed on the ring road, and also with the increase in e-cars. So now that urban landscape is more and more healthy and serene. All right. Well, Djamel Klouche, you worked on the Grand Paris consultations as early as 2008. Can you share with us your experience to close that first round of discussions? All right, yes, I'll try. I'm going to show you a number of older things, perhaps. You know, that picture was taken in this very building 15 years ago, so it all started here, in a way, after the consultation on the Grand Paris project. And, you know, this is something that I really wanted to remind you all of. It was a rather exceptional milestone that led to great things, including the network you spoke of, Nicolas. I think that residents in Ile-de-France do not quite realize just how transformed their practices have been and how they will further transform once the Grand Paris Express is fully up and running. I chose to speak to you about 15 years ago, and back then the question of mobility for the architects that we were in our multidisciplinary team was actually central, you know. How can you move away from the whole rationale of commute and movement between Paris city center and the outskirts, but rather move towards a suburb to suburb rationale? Well, back then we decided to look into Tokyo. Tokyo is a special place where you're really at one with the landscape. When you're on the Yamanote line, metro line in Tokyo, that's something that you can truly realize. It's all about experience, having that experience with the landscape. And back then, architects were really looking into perhaps developing a suspended metro line that would be hovering above the city. We thought that that would be best. But a more pragmatic choice was made back then with Christian Blanc, who was in charge of the Capital Metropolis Secretariat, as I believe it was called. And they said that, no, it should be an underground network, because when you're at minus 10, 15, or 20 meters underground, you do not have to enter into the same kinds of negotiations. And indeed, thanks to that decision, well, today we're now opening up already the first train stations. Now, let me talk about Pleyel. The Pleyel area is where there was a piano factory. So there was a piano factory over there, built on that crossroad, and as early as the 1960s, this image is from a Paris Match magazine, and that's the kind of vision that they had back then. And now this is what it looks like. And the largest train station of the Grand Paris Express network will be right there in Pleyel. I remember that back then we thought, look, might as well actually add another advanced Gare du Nord train station underneath that station, so a high-speed station underneath that station, but it will be a hub, even if we don't have that high-speed connection. And here you have that really strong divide between both areas standing on one side and on the other. But with the help of Brauzek and others, we said that we really needed all the new lines, with lines 13, 14, 15, 16 as well, I believe, on the other side of that divide. But SGP said that all stations should remain on on the other side, on the opposite side. So that was a huge discussion, but it was the very first time that the Plaine Saint-Denis was kind of looking at itself in a sort of an east-west relation, whereas before, you know, La Plaine Saint-Denis would have only seen itself faced with Paris, but now it was more of an east-west kind of rationale. So that would lead to complete transformation of that territory. This is the axonometry that we worked on back then. Has been slightly changed since, but it's opened the door to the Olympic Games. You know, on the Seine side, all of that is actually going to happen. Actually, we would have never imagined that that could happen, but when you're working on mobility, you have two reflexes. Either you may be tempted to concentrate everything into the same spot, but the other reflex, and I think that's what you should prioritize, you want to stretch things out. In Lyon, with the Pardieu station, which is the second largest train station in France after Paris, we really advocated for transportation networks to truly serve cities and urban planning. And in order to do that, you really want to multiply access points instead of having that one single spot to enter into the network. You really want multiple spots of access to have that metropolitan machine that's much more stretched out to serve the city at large. And now that we had that bridge, public space enter the discussion a little more clearer. And by taking over the existing roadways, we were able to really work on the various access points, and we were able to say that the Grand Paris Express network and the metropolitan fabric can collaborate to fully transform the metropolitan landscape of Paris. To conclude, here is an image I wanted to show to you. And here I'm on a slightly lower scale, compared with what Alexandre showed us at metropolis level. So you have one train station, various lines, as part of a larger area and territory. Mobility is all about having that. It's all about playing with dimensions and scales. You really want to have that visibility. In Pardieu, we spoke of that easy ground access once you reach the train station, and that was our vision for Pardieu. There are multiple infrastructures, so you really want to be able to move around as easily as possible. You really want to be able to understand your connections as easily as possible. You may stop, you may speed up, you may stroll around. So basically, mobility landscapes are extremely interesting because you're at a crossroads between various temporalities, and these are also places where you want to imagine certain landscapes, nature. And one last image to conclude. You know, Marc Miman is not here, but he delivered this a few weeks ago, and with that we'll be able to truly connect the Plaine historical area with that crossing. And here we have a mega project of transformation as part of a wider area. Okay, so since you referred to scaling, and to time and space, the kind of space that we may cross, that we may connect to other spaces. Pierre, Alain, Trévélo, if I may turn to you, how can we truly transform infrastructures as part of transformation projects in terms of spatial transformation, in terms of having a long-term vision? I believe that the four of you share that awareness of how you really want to have that long-term vision, that deep vision of a long-term approach. I mean, it's quite crazy to see that there is no current representation of the underground surface at metropolis scale. So, Pierre-Alain, in terms of infrastructure, the works undertaken in the past few years, what have they changed in the way that you approach projects, generally speaking? Well, to start with, these infrastructures, as we were saying, well, it makes you think of metaphors between infrastructures and geographical structures. There are many of us that tend to do that, and it's quite fair to do that, actually. And perhaps it's relevant because infrastructures are born out of a certain program, and historically that program may actually disappear. Military infrastructures are quite a good example of that. But these formerly military infrastructures remain as infrastructures, as foundations, which remain in the longer term, which has made it possible for the city to renew itself over time. So here you have a geological space that makes it possible that lays the foundation for future transformation. So you should not look at this in terms of programs, but rather in terms of sites. So architecture with such a dimension that allows it to be both a program and a site, and to further become a site. So that's quite interesting, I think. And also it may lead to other thoughts about mobility today. You know, again, with the idea of public space. Well, infrastructures in their current programming should have the capacity to either disappear or evolve so as to become more and more a public space that can serve local communities and territories. Bas Smets, you've worked on the notion of augmented landscapes, if you can share a few words about this. Well, landscapes are not just a decor here, they produce an atmosphere. This is something that we're all convinced of today, but I think that 10 or 15 years ago, it was just the start of that whole idea. You know, creating microclimates with a well-constructed and built public space. And so that's where the underground areas are more and more important, because that's where water can circulate, that's where the roots of the trees are to be found. So we really want to map out all of the underground areas across cities, so as to have an accurate view. And what have we realized? Well, you know, there have been there were more and more floods. And this has an impact on aquifers, which are no longer in any position to water trees. So we want that fertile ground. And with the city authorities, we looked into it for the trees to create fertile ground corridors where we store water in artificial aquifers that are underground. And in order to do that, you need to map out your underground areas. Now, most of the time we know where the pipeworks are, but sometimes, you may unearth a couple of them that are completely unexpected. So you really want to map your underground areas.
Vous voulez réagir?
Djamel Klouche, is there something you'd like to say? Or is there someone who'd like to talk about substrates and soil? So what was your question again? No, we're talking about the La Défense, and we're talking about the substrate, the fact that nowadays architects, they have to work on both infrastructure on one hand, and they have to also focus on things like landscaping and mobility. So it's about the long-term vision and the physical depth that these buildings take on. Going deep down into the ground. Actually, during the workshops on the Grand Paris, we held one workshop which was on the inevitable train station. And I can't remember who said it, maybe it was someone from Cachan or maybe the mayor of Massy, said that a train station shouldn't necessarily be identifiable as such. And that's the idea here. So here we're working in very complex environments, be it at Pleyel, Lyon, La Défense. And train stations in those environments, they actually take on a geological aspect because you need the right sort of soil and earth to be able to dig through and tunnel through, and it needs to be stable enough to take on a train station, but it also needs to be a space that the people who use the train station, they can really engage with it. So we called it the inevitable train station, and it actually comes from a Japanese experience. So when you're in Tokyo, Shibuya, or Jinkuku, they're probably the biggest train stations in the world, but you don't actually see them. They completely disappear into the urban environment. You actually go down under the underground, and you walk about 500 meters away from these areas, you're in a very small household type of districts where you've got small boutiques and the like. So it's really interesting to see just how intelligently they designed those trains and the stations. For me, a train station should be something that is where you just you go in a hole, go down, disappear, and then pop up elsewhere. It's geological in a way. A station, it should be easy to get in and out of. It's like going to the local bakery. And I mean, these spaces are spaces where people spend a lot of time, so it's probably a bit more complex than your local bakery because you have to go up and down a couple of floors. But that's the way we need to think about it. We need to think about it as being permanent fixtures in the urban environment. They need to be very flexible spaces, and it's the more flexible they are, the more longevity they can have. I'm always very wary of train station where they govern the shape of the local landscape. And I think it should be the opposite. A station should actually be there to better serve the local environment, but not actually shape that environment. It needs to be an infrastructure where anything is possible in the future. So the infrastructure should be there. Now, it should be buried under, say, a green mountain or a forest of skyscrapers, or it should be a kind city that pops up above it. Or it could be anything. It could be a city where you have business and housing combining in the same space. That is what a train station is for me. It's 15 years since we started the Grand Paris, And we're now starting to see stations popping up out of the ground. And I think we still have time to say, what is this train network meant to create within the Greater Paris area? Because it is radically changing the space. And I don't think we have fully understood the extent of the change that is underway. So you're talking about the power it has to transform and shape a landscape, but the fact that it can really transform the landscape? Well, I think the transport infrastructure is probably the most long-term infrastructure that we build. Well, that ties back to what we're saying about public space. So, Pierre, Alain, you are in charge of a team of designers working on the public use of train stations and the areas around spaces. So they have the ability to transform cities in the long term. And this is something that we've very much seen through large-scale mobility services, as we saw through COVID. So how do you engage with that notion of a public space being highly malleable and changing? Well, I think this is something that we've already talked about a bit. It's when talking about the simplicity or the easiness of working with the ground. It's kind of like, so a child, when a child enters a public space, they need to be able to understand exactly how it works. I mean, they're probably not going to understand everything, but they need to be able to find their way around. It needs to be obvious, and I think that comes from its ability to change, to be readily understood. And there's also a notion of availability, because public spaces, they, especially around train stations, I mean, this is something that we don't really talk about a lot, but around stations, like the major train stations, there is a definite need for the train stations to play a social role, because it's places where people come to meet, people who don't really have anywhere to go. It's places where people can come to. This is something that you definitely see in Rome. It's actually quite surprising. But we are all very familiar with that here in Paris as well, in the Greater Paris area, because places where people can come to for refuge, almost. So this is something that needs to be taken into mind. So I guess it ties back to notions of being evident or self-evident or simplicity. Alexandre actually was talking about it a little earlier. He was talking about how people traveling from one outer suburb to another outer suburb, those sorts of trips are happening more and more. And I still don't think we've taken full measure of how much that is going to change, how much the new metro lines are going to radically alter the way people live in the outer suburbs. Because currently, we live in a world where everything is built around the center of Paris, where that is no longer going to be the case in the future, where that central role that plays Châtelet-Léal is going to disappear. So I think we need to look at things at a micro level when looking at the future transport networks. Now, while the distances granted are much greater than just inner city Paris, we're talking about a network of public spaces that exist between the connected train stations, but even beyond that. It opens up ways to actually engage with cities in a new, different way, creates new experiences, local communities. And I think that's really fundamental here. Another thing which is really quite exciting when talking about the Grand Paris and the SGP. And, okay, maybe the SGP has already been working on this as a topic, but one thing that the history of urban planning has shown us is that no matter what city you're in, when you create public transport networks, there is an initial effect in that you have denser populations but more stretched out populations. So it's quite an interesting dichotomy between the two. So when you actually see the number of people who end up using the RER, the regional train systems, but outside of the Grand Paris Express, well, that number is rising simply because it is becoming more and more possible to actually tie in parts of the metropolitan area with each other. And I think that's where public spaces play a fundamental role, be it stations for the RER, the regional train lines, stations that aren't already part of the 68 new train stations. This is an interesting way of seeing how these spaces will go on to become parts of the project, even though they officially aren't part of the project. This is something that will happen in the future. We may not have seen it coming, or will have been an unthought of outcome of it, but these sorts of places will exist. So the number of people moving about in the greater metropolitan area is going to increase because of greater access. Is that what you're saying? Is this an observation? Is this part of your forecasting that you're seeing as part of the Apur work? That you're thinking of it because as the transport network increases inside, but you also feel that individual transport or private transport is going to increase as well. What limitations do you foresee?
C'est fort probable. C'est fort probable d'abord parce que.
Well, I think a lot of things are possible because obviously they're going to have a much better access to transport. About 80% of people are going to be about 40 minutes away from Gustave Roussy, which is going to be a major hub. Now, while I think there is going to be a large number of people, seniors, policy tends to say that senior citizens are going to be living at home a lot more, but the more seniors are going to be living at home and not in retirement homes or nursing homes, well, the more carers and family carers are going to have to travel to see them. So while the seniors aren't going to be traveling, the carers are going to be traveling. And we can see that with a sense of peace of mind, but also we're quite mindful of it. But something that people don't realize, or people say, well, people don't realize, but there are 160 major stations, so metro, RER, tramway stations that have been created in the metropolitan area between 2020 and 2030. 68 of them are part of the Grand Paris Express, but there are more than that. So here we're talking about a fundamental change in the way people move within the region. 169 stations between now and 2030. So that's 100 new stations. That's a 20% increase. It's quite huge. You're right. We've never seen that sort of increase before. It's completely unheard of. But we mustn't forget that infrastructure are also changing. To give you two prime examples of that, well, we have roads. So we have the roads by the riverbanks here in Paris. You've got the A86. You've got roads that are closing down, roads that are changing scale, size, use. In the northeast of Paris, there are about 50 hectares of roadways which have been transformed back into usable space. So infrastructure itself is constantly changing. And yet, in the south of France, they're building major toll roads. Well, sure, but that's elsewhere. So the A69, it's a major autoroad all the way down to Toulouse. And these are seeing a considerable backlash or pushback from environmental organizations. But it's always interesting to see how infrastructure can change and evolve. Bas Smets, you have worked specifically on that question. It was a case for TVK, who transformed a major highway in Belgium. And it's interesting to see what is happening elsewhere around the world, where other people are creating high-speed infrastructure. Just a few days ago, the Young Urban Planners Award was announced, and it was given to Karim Layani for bringing forward a counter-offer for softer mobility options to counter the A86. So what are your views of these sorts of mental break that we have when talking about major infrastructure that we're completely changing, and other offers that we're now creating? Bas Smets, what do you have to say for that? Well, which one to pick?
C'est toujours concret.
Avant de terminer dans 5 minutes.
Yep, and you've only got 5 minutes.
La mobilité comme laboratoire urbain.
Okay, mobility as an urban laboratory, or as an urban lab. So what I see interesting about bolstering and building up when talking about building up on the urban environment, so there is one invariable truth in everything that we do with these sorts of constructions, in that we can transform them. And the same goes for mobility. Take Brussels, for example. We created a connection between the Gare du Midi and the Gare du Nord. It was a tunnel to connect to both stations, and back in the day it followed the contour lines because the trains didn't have enough power to do it, but now it's a perfectly horizontal line, straight line, which connects the upper and lower parts of the city, and it's we've actually created a form of dike to also create a water retention basin to avoid any flooding of the line. So it's quite interesting to see exactly how we engage with these sorts of projects at the community level, because these are very much long-term infrastructures because they're built upon the natural topography of the local environment. So that's what I wanted to say quickly about mobility from a concrete point of view. Now, actually, there was a competition that we won not to build a new motorway, but actually to alter a motorway, and it was actually between Antwerp and Bruges. They were actually ripping up the old road surface, and we won the design competition based on a simple idea. Instead of trying to hide the infrastructure, we said, let's use the infrastructure to create more landscape. Because oftentimes they would just say, let's just put up a couple of few trees and pretend it's not even there. But between Bruges and Knokke, we've actually got the polders, which is a place with lots of dikes where every single tree was planted by man. It's completely man-made environment, but it's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, slowly being built up. So the mobility can create landscapes hundreds of years later, but we can also see new infrastructure, new mobility as being a landscape in its own right that we're creating. If I just may, I just want to expand on that. So actually, at the school in Versailles, I actually work with students on infrastructure, but also work on European railways. And I like to ask them a question. I say, okay, so if people are no longer going to be taking planes, then the roads are going to change, but also the railways, they are also going to change the way that we see Europe by 2050. And when you actually map Europe according to the railways, there are plenty of railways throughout the Eastern European countries. Now, they don't always work, but they have a pre-existing network, a very dense network of railways. Now, in France, it's not as dense. And we look at both passenger transport as well as freight by rail. There are so many things that are still yet to be done, and so I'm really interested in how we can accelerate that shift. I mean, if you need an autoroute like the one you're talking about, the A69 near Toulouse, well, the reason that we need that is because we aren't providing enough alternatives, so I think we really need to accelerate the number of alternatives that we can offer. And railways at a European scale is a real area to think of. You know, currently people think it's a broken system, but we need to engage with them because it could be a new spearhead of a way of building new communities in the future. Well, I think that brings us to an end of our time. I'd like to thank everyone, and we'll head over to Philippe Tetrac for our next session.